Vi tar ordet. Vi tar ordet. Du lytter og ser på MiRA Senterets videopodkast. Vi tar ordet. Today's podcast is in English, and we are going to discuss women victims of asylum policies. For the past several years, almost decades, European countries have been restricting their immigration and asylum policies to keep the migrants out. Europe has almost become a fortress with high walls and iron doors, which are often closed to people in need of protection. The asylum policies are not specifically gendered, but they affect women differently from men. Today we are very happy to have in studio Cristel Amiss from London, and we are going to discuss how these policies affect women in Britain, and then we will come into also, of course, around Europe. And Cristel is an activist and also coordinating a campaign against deportation. And this campaign is a part of Global Women Center. So Cristel, welcome.
Thank you so much, Fakhra. Thank you.
And before we dive into the asylum policies and migration issues, I would like to know a little bit about you and a little bit about the Global Women Center and about your campaign.
Okay, well, in that order, beginning with me, I was born in Britain. My parents were from Nigeria, my father, and Germany, my mother. And they came to the UK, like a lot of migrants and immigrants at the time after the Second World War, to help rebuild Britain. You know, the governments invited immigrants in from the Caribbean, from African countries. And my mother, who was 14 at the time that the war broke out, and was very traumatized, as many German people were, by what happened. So she came. They met at the hospital, where they both worked, and I was the product of that meeting. My father had nothing to do with me, and as I said at the conference yesterday, I'm eternally grateful that my mother never gave me up for adoption, despite facing, as she must have done, horrendous racism.
At that time, it was very common that people could give children for adoption, women or single women?
Interestingly, there were a lot of mixed-race children. They called us brown babies. And partly that was due to the GIs from America being in Britain at the bases. One of my best friends for a long time was a English mum, GI father, and he was put into adoption because his mother was married and her husband was going to come back from the war. So that was quite common at that time, that you were put into adoption. In fact, my mother was told you should give the child for adoption, you won't be able to manage. And the person who told her that probably didn't do it with malice, but was thinking, white German woman, already subject to racism. There was so much against the German people, obviously, after the war. Brown baby, recipe for horrors. But she fought and she kept me. And I'm eternally grateful she did, because,
yes.
you know, that was...
So are we.
Thank you. Because that, you know, that's really what in many ways shaped my life. Without going into a lot of other history, of which I think for any child growing up there always is, but I became an activist. In fact, from my student days, we at that time were protesting in the 60s, the late 60s, against the Vietnam War. So many of us as students would come. I lived in Birmingham, we'd go to London, we'd protest. And we protested a lot of things, you know, the conditions for us as students. And you may recall that, in fact, Germany and France and many of the European countries, students were at the forefront of a lot of protests. The thing we were not doing as students then was connecting internationally with countries in the global south.
Right, because colonialism was not an issue.
No,
Right.
not like it is now.
Exactly.
Eternally grateful that the students are decolonizing the whole of their education, or at least trying to. So yes, that was the difference in those days. But I went on to get involved in other activism.
But were they looking at racism? I mean, although they were not looking at colonialism, but racism, was that an issue for the student movement?
You know, it was less talked about. I mean, there were, if you like, I think fewer of us who were going, by that I mean people of colour, who were going into secondary education. Oftentimes, a lot of my friends were apprentices. Birmingham was the car city, so they went into the car industry. Did less in terms of education. Now it's very different. You know, the education is a much more mixed scenario with people from all around the world now. I mean, the English education system depends on importing foreign students.
Exactly.
But then it was less so. So racism, you know, there was not the big anti-racist movements, although they were beginning, and they were coming not from the students, but more from the communities. You know, if I lived in a very mixed community, Handsworth, which had riots, as did parts of London, you know, and we were out protesting against the treatment that we were getting as black people from every institution, but in particular the police. I mean, the police were always horrendously sexist and racist, and still are. The Met Police have got a global reputation for the things that they've been responsible for. But movements gradually build, and they come in waves, don't they? They take on particular issues. So racism was definitely beginning to be a big part of what people in Britain, anti-racist movements, were fighting to build. And that is the history of the Wages for Housework campaign, founded by Selma James, is anti-racist, anti-sexist initiatives that fight for and from the perspective of those of us with the least power, which is usually women, and in particular women of colour, women with disabilities, lesbian women, and different sexualities and genders. You know, those are the things that we have in common, that we are catching the same treatment of discrimination and prejudice from every institution we have to engage with. And the campaign was really my starting point, because the demand was very simple. Those of us that are working in the home and on the land and in the community should have a wage for that work, that unwaged work, that unrecognised work, that invisible work that the entire society depends on, and only notices that it's not there if we stop doing it.
Right.
And that was, to me, one of the most attractive prospects, you know, that I would get a wage for all of those things that I'd done, that people took for granted that I would do, that all of us would do as women and as carers.
It's still not solved. I mean, wages for housework is still not...
We're winning things in different places.
Exactly.
So I first came to the campaign in the mid-'80s. I was living in Bristol at the time with my partner, a woman, and we were raising children. She had 3 children, and I became their non-biological mother. And we decided it was easier and better to move to London to do the work we had both become committed to. So we came to the Crossroads Women's Centre, which at that time was called the King's Cross Women's Centre. Okay, in the heart of a place which they've gentrified the hell out of now. But at that time, it was a squat. So the campaign grew out of the squatters' movement, occupying properties that nobody else wanted. And from those early days of a squat, which needed a lot of work on it, we have now arrived at the point where we own our own centre, Crossroads Women's Centre, in the heart of Kentish Town, which is a very working class part of London, northwest London.
And it's a beautiful center when we visited. I mean, it's just a wonderful place. So tell us about this campaign against deportation.
Okay, so Wages for Housework campaign has always focused on, and the groups that are part of it have focused on the issue of immigration and migration, because that's who we are, or we're descendants of. So the justice that we have demanded has always been the right to move country, to get safety and protection wherever we want to go in the world, that we should not be restricted. Selma always used to say, capital travels freely, why not people? So if money can scoot around the world and the source of that is our work, then we have the right to go wherever we want. So the campaign for that we call now Global Women Against Deportation has its foundation in those early years where women were coming to the centre with issues around their immigration problems. Sometimes they came as dependents on men, and they were meant to be able to come in, because at those days you were supposed to be able to bring your spouse in. We're talking 70s, 80s.
Right.
The government would do horrendous things like they would test for virginity.
Exactly, yeah, I remember that.
Yeah, I mean, this is the kind of things that some people can't, understand. How could that be a possibility even?
Right.
So they've always been hostile and anti-immigrant policies in place.
And especially, I mean, look at building on stereotypes that Asian women should be virgin when they get married, and you're checking their virginity. Yeah. This is a horrible situation.
Horrible.
So,
but there were campaigns against that, because people, I think that it's true to say there have always been people on the side of immigrants and migrants, because that's also who people relate to. We're not in these compartmental boxes.
Right, exactly.
So that we are always conscious and relating to each other and understanding that if you get treated this way, I'm going to be next. So, but there's a compassion that is still alive and kicking, no matter what the governments come up with.
Right.
So over the years, we've challenged the legislation. Global Women Against Deportations consists of Women Against Rape, which is one of the oldest anti-rape organisations in the country. It consists of the All African Women's Group, which is a group that came together because of who they are and what they wanted to fight for. And they were women initially from Eritrea, in great numbers coming to the centre, one pregnant woman sleeping rough. I mean, the issues were many and they were varied. But the thing is that the women were ready to fight for themselves, given that they got the space and the resources and the help that they needed to do that. So every single one of the organisations, Women of Colour in the Global Women's Strike, Legal Action for Women, Support Not Separation, there are 15 based at the centre, and every single group has something to do with the issues around immigration and migration, that particularly from a women's perspective. Because 70% of the women seeking asylum in the UK are survivors of rape and or domestic and other sexual violence. That's very hidden.
Are there many women who have come through family reunion and then have been abused and seeking asylum on independent grounds?
That's right.
Yeah,
I mean, that is the biggest problem, because inevitably the authorities, I mean, even for women who are trying to get a conviction for rape who don't have a status problem, the chief problem is that the authorities don't believe us.
Right.
And there's nothing harder, in my mind, than to have to prove that you were raped. And to do it, you have to bear every single horrific detail about what happened to you to some complete and utter stranger. And then they're going to say, well, not sure I believe that. Or the other ways in which they refuse women the protection for asylum is they say, well, it might have happened to you, but you can go back now.
Exactly.
It's safe to go back. Or it might have happened to you, but they were after your brother or your family. So you're not the real victim in that sense. So there's horrible reasons.
It's the same kind of problems we are facing, that on the one hand, the governments say that women who are victims of violence, they will be given protection. But when they seek protection, the burden of evidence to prove that violence has happened and on that scale that they have to get residence permit is so impossible for many to prove. And I think this is a common issue for all European migrant and refugee women, that the intention of the laws are totally opposite the practice, because practice of the law is to deport as many as possible. And it is very easy for them to say that, yeah, go back to your country, it is safe for you. But it's not safe for women. I mean, we know that countries like Pakistan or like Zimbabwe or like Eritrea, they are not safe for women. So these are very common issues, and that's why I'm so pleased that you call your campaign global campaign, so that that it can other European countries, sisters and brothers who are fighting for the common issues can also join in that.
That is so important, particularly because Britain exited the European Union. But they didn't exit it in the sense that every single government is working together.
Right,
the
exactly.
policies that they bring in, these are not mistakes or they didn't quite give enough thought. These are deliberate policies that begin with, we don't want any more people of colour in Europe. We're going to shut or we want particular people with these skills and those skills. And of course, where does that place the UN Convention for Rights of Refugees?
Right.
It's as though they want to tear up all of those international laws. And we see that so with Palestine, with what's happening in Palestine. There are all these laws that are meant to protect, to stop the settlers, the Israelis. They're just being torn up. So we are really in a very dangerous moment in time. And the fact that we are connecting internationally and building movements, because that's the one thing that the attack on Gaza has done, is it's brought forward a massive, millionfold movement of people who say, this is not right. We won't have this genocide in front of our eyes, because they can't bear seeing it. You know, when it was, as you mentioned, Eritrean women, or in the case now with Namibian women who are suffering terrible domestic violence, they can't get a single bit of protection from the state, the police for. Right. Those things seem to be happening undercover.
This
stuff.
Yeah, right.
People are not even seeing what's happening in Sudan or other countries. But these genocides are many, and they take different forms.
Right.
And the fact that there are movements coming together, whether that is the young people who are smashing up the factories in the UK and the US that are producing the arms that destroy Palestinian people, or whether that is the young people saying that the climate is, we've desperately got to do something, otherwise we have no future. And they're ready to protest at levels that, those of us who go back some have not seen either, because they're ready to go to prison.
Because everything is now connected. I mean,
exactly.
And I'm so happy that young people who are involved in environmental movement, I mean, they see the connection immediately. They see the connection between arms production and wars and racism and all that. They are really, and they give us hope. But let's come back to women asylum seekers. Are there like other issues which are specific to women beside deportation, or what are the other issues, and how Brexit has affected women asylum seekers? These are also interesting things, because earlier women could just freely move around the countries. now Britain is no longer a part of
yes.
Union.
Yeah. It hasn't stopped the numbers necessarily of and you can't stop the numbers of people who are going to come. As you know, there's the problem of people making the most dangerous journeys across the English Channel to reach. What has changed in a way is that the successive governments have taken away the rights, the rights to even being able to have decent food and clothing and a place to live. Those rights have been changed so that people are now living in, or they've lived in pretty bad conditions before, but to come to dream up of something like a floating prison in the middle of a seaport and say, we're going to put people on this barge, and the women that come to the centre who are in the hotels, and these hotels, they can't get decent food. They get up to, if they're single women, they get £8 a week. Some get more if you've got a child. You can't live in London or any big city or anywhere, frankly, on that sort of money. And that's a deliberate attempt to make it so unpleasant to try and survive here that you give up and you go back. The one thing that the centre in a way provides for women is a break from the isolation and the knowledge that some women, even if it's taken them 15, 20 years to get their status, they've won because they've kept at it and because they've worked together collectively on their cases, that they've informed each other. You know, don't do that. When I did that, this happened. There's this very nitty-gritty practical stuff that is shared by the women who've won, with the women who are still fighting. And the word you used earlier was hope. If you've still got that hope all along, you'll carry on no matter what laws that change, no matter what conditions you're put in. But the thing that is probably the most important thing is that we give people the idea of what your rights are. If you don't know what your rights are, you don't know that, for example, if you're making an asylum claim, you should have a legal aid lawyer. Now, I was astonished to hear that here in Norway you don't get that. There's no legal aid lawyers.
Yeah, it's not free.
It's not free.
I mean, it is supposed to be free, but in reality it's not.
Yeah. They're moving that way in the UK. They pretend to be free,
I mean,
but
Norway,
only to this point, and then, if this happens, you've got to pay.
Yeah. I mean, Norway has become worse lately, so we are also very worried about, future, what will happen.
But women's asylum claims are often very complex and complicated, and beginning with the fact that it's hard to speak about what you've been through because of the trauma.
Right.
And that has to be recognised, and that's one of the things we've pushed for time and again with the authorities, to get guidelines in place. Not that that means anybody abides by them, but at least you've got them there, that women must be considered as vulnerable witnesses.
Yeah, and also should have independent right for asylum.
Always.
Because that is one thing also very serious, that when they come with the husbands or when the family comes, they usually evaluate one application and they don't accept women's independent right for asylum. And this is also one of the very anti-gender equality policies. So because immigration laws have all anti-gender equality policies, and people are really blind to that. When it comes to, this stereotyping migrant women, then everyone say, they are analphabet, they are staying at home, they are religious, they are this and that, and they need to be emancipated. And then you say, so what are the options to emancipate them? Then the legal options are not there. There is so much gender discrimination built within the immigration legislation that even women's organizations who are fighting for gender equality do not see that.
That's right. They're not interested in fighting for the same freedom.
Exactly.
Yeah, which is really such a huge problem in general about everything.
Yeah.
If
So
you don't
let's-
fight that, if you don't fight for the most vulnerable in our society, you will be next.
Right.
Please
right.
understand that.
Yeah,
It is
exactly.
not us over here and you over there. It
There,
is
yeah.
we. And
Yeah.
that's the thing that is changing.
Yeah,
People are
right.
putting it together.
Right. And there was also a big discussion about sending refugees to Rwanda.
Rwanda.
So what has happened with the new government? Is it, has it gone better or
Okay.
what?
There was a massive movement that formed. We joined a coalition called Action Against Detention and Deportation, which was a number of groups across the country who were all absolutely fit to be tied at this idea of the Rwanda outsourcing your responsibilities to protect people to a country that was a genocidal country with a history of rape and the most horrendous torture. So that, in a way, connected us with a lot of other people who were not necessarily the best friends of migrants, but couldn't stomach that. That was a step too far, even for a Tory government. So we had some friends in high places on that one, right up to the Archbishop of Canterbury.
Right.
So, yes, the movement we did not defeat it by getting it out of the Tory rule book. It was a fact that Labour could see it was not going to work, and they abandoned it when they took power. However, Labour, for all it's supposed to be on the side of working class people, as though migrants aren't working class people, has now come up or is looking to find another country that might be more acceptable, Albania, for example, or some other. They will always look for those kind of hostile environments because they've said, oh, we've got to stop the boat people. Even Labour said we've got to stop the boat people.
But this is this is so inhuman, because all the European countries are now united on that we should put refugees into some third countries, and those third countries are already taking so many refugees. But they keep on creating refugees. They keep on creating
that is the point
asylum seekers
all the time that we make.
But you had one very interesting point when we were discussing that we are here now to claim
what we're entitled to.
Can you elaborate that a little bit, because it's very interesting.
It came about because
we can wind
sure.
our talk with that.
So it came about because one of the women in All African Women's Group quite early on went onto a radio station and said that she had claimed asylum, she had won her status, and now she wanted to bring her children to join her. And she had some of the most horrendous racist callers calling in and saying, how dare she, why should she even have the right to be in this country? And we thought we've got to be able to defend ourselves from that position. And so women of colour in Global Women's Strike started to gather facts in relation to what has been stolen from countries in the global south, to be able to show you have taken our people, beginning with slavery, colonialisation, you've stolen our lands, you've made our lands, you've decimated them, we can't grow food, you're driving us off from with wars and everything. We put all of that together and started a fact sheet which shows we have every right to be in every single country in the West, because every single one of them has benefited from the history of colonialism and the theft. We're starting with the theft from Africa, but we're going to go to India, we're going to go to Australia, Latin America. It is the same white supremacist colonial attitudes which are still continuing to this day, that think that they have the right to go and steal all of the minerals from Congo, cause the wars, the divisions, make us all divided from each other, not only in countries of the global south, but right here in the countries where we are. That's the tactic, divide us all, make us fight over the crumbs. But the reality is that white working class people never benefited from the wealth that the David Cameron type families got when they were compensated for having lost their slaves. Enslaved people got nothing. But the owners got humongous amounts. And the countries that are still paying the price for that, like Haiti, the first country to liberate slave people, you know, these are the things, these are the history and the things that we need to put together collectively to understand our position and what our entitlements are and what rights we have, and to really get rid of our shackles, from the multinationals to the military dictatorships to everything that is trying to destroy the world. I say invest in caring, not killing. More recently we've said women make life, investing in caring, not genocide.
Right, right.
You know, so that we're putting those things together, giving ourselves the power to understand our rights as human beings, caring for the people and the planet, all of us that are doing that, every race, every gender, we're entitled. And we should get that entitlement in whatever form we want it. If it's money, fine. If it's land, fine. If it's a clean environment and air we can breathe and seas that have fish in them again, these are the things we want to fight for, you know, across everything that is a struggle.
Absolutely. And this is so important for our children to learn, because our children should not have that kind of shame and that kind of burden that their parents or we are a burden on these societies. They should have this, they should be proud that their forefathers contributed to the welfare and
created the world.
Created the welfare of these societies, and we have equal rights to be here and to enjoy that wealth. So this is very, very interesting. So
the real burden of the billionaires.
Exactly.
They're our burden.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much for such
My
a wonderful
Thank you for inviting.
Talk. And I will only say that seeking asylum is a universal human right. It's not a crime. And as wars and conflicts continue, there will always be people who are risking their lives for a better place and safer place. And for many, this might be the only option. Women asylum seekers have fled war, persecution, and sexual violence. So we need to create a global movement, as the movement of people is also global. Migration is global. Asylum is global. Wars are now global. So we need to create global movements in order to support each other and in order to build strength to fight back and to push back that inhuman immigration policies in all European countries, including US and Australia, New Zealand, all the Western countries, who are in fact not taking the responsibility for what they are creating.